During the migration period in Europe, a branch of the Germanized Iranians, known as the Alans, wound up emigrating from the Caucasus all the way across Europe together with the Goths, and this western subset of the Indo-Iranians established a joint kingdom in Spain that they called Goth-Alania, which later winds up being called Catalonia through a Latin corruption of the word. And this is where the origin of the name of this contested province of present-day Spain comes from. That's not to say that the Catalans are the descendants of the Goths and the Alans. It's just that the etymological roots of Catalonia and Catalan descend from this historical realm in Spain that the Goths and the Alans were the rulers of. The Alans had already been in Spain and founded their own dynastic state there before the Gothic invasion, but when the Goths arrived, they merged into one state. This Visigothic Atlantic kingdom would have never happened in Europe if the Hunnic invasions that were spearheaded by Attila hadn't occurred. Thanks, Attila! What the fuck? I love the Huns now! Although the Alans were displaced and absorbed by the demographically and culturally dominant native Hispano-Roman population, they left their mark on the Iberian Peninsula in numerous ways, with one of them being the etymological origins of Catalonia. Though there are some debates about this, like, for example, another theory is that Catalan denotes a native Iberian tribe called the Lusitani, but how does Lusitania wind up being called Catalan? Another one argues that it's a cognate of the Spanish word for castle, Castile, and Castile and Catalan have the same etymological root. The Goth-Alania theory is still the most prevalent one because the name of Gothia has been found in the medieval sources. There was a buffer zone between the Franks and the Moors during the Islamic colonization of the Iberian Peninsula, referred to as the March of Gothia, if I'm not mistaken. The March of Gothia, something like that. The Byzantine sources from the Middle Ages also claim that it's related to the merging of the Goths and the Alans, but tracing a point of origin of the word of the term Catalan through this original theory to the former Visigothic Alanian kingdom logically makes sense if you consider how Hispania was ever adopted as a geographic designation for the entire Iberian Peninsula. This is what the Romans did with the Iberian Peninsula. During the Roman colonization, the entire Iberian Peninsula was referred to as Hispania by the geographers of the empire, and according to the political geography, this political region even included present-day Portugal, which isn't Spanish. Over time, Hispania became the generic term to refer to this part of Europe, and by any stretch of the word, it was the Romans who invented this notion of Spain, or rather Hispania, as we know it. But this theory about Catalonia being rooted in Goth-Alania creates some problems in the modern context, especially when it comes to nation building and national identity, and especially when it comes to the Catalans making the case as to why they should separate from Spain. If Hispania was the Roman name for the Iberian Peninsula, does that mean that the Catalans can revision history and claim that the Visigothic and the Alanian states were both Catalan ones? Well, the answer to that is no, as the name Hispania is still used during the Visigothic domination of the region, and the first notion of peninsular unity also arose during their reign. According to the last of the ancient scholars in the region, Isidore of Seville, Hispania was considered a synonym for the Iberian Peninsula as a whole, and in his Historia Gothorum, Hispania begins to be considered a Gothic nation under the reign of King Sunthila, and that's more than a century and a half after the kingdom was first established. The lingua franca was still Latin in its vulgar form, but amongst one another, the ruling class spoke in Gothic, and the locals of each region of the state would have spoken in their own vernacular. The first capital of their empire was Barcelona, the most famous Catalan city, but then they relocated to Toledo later on, where the Alans were active in before the Goths came. And it's also important to point out that Alan is also in the name of the city of Catalonia. Barcelona. The earliest precursor to the Catalan language developed as a localized dialect of popular Latin just before and during the collapse of the Roman Empire. But you don't just go back in time and throw in modern nationalities into a pre-modern and pre-national era. The Visigothic kingdom is the basis of the entire Spanish nation. The Visigoths considered themselves to be the kings of the entire political geography of the Iberian Peninsula. All their subjects paid their taxes to the dynasty and fought for their state, but the locals and the provinces, including present-day Catalonia, they would have identified by their own geographical cal, for there wasn't any concept of a nation-state or national identity at that point in history. No pre-Latin or non-Latin language other than Basque has survived. We don't know what the primordial natives called themselves either. The term Iberian is also not native, and it was also imposed on the locals through Greek and Latin sources, named after the Ebro River in present-day Spain. Or maybe that was what the Iberians referred to themselves, and the Greeks and the Roman writers just followed their lead, but we'll never know because we can't go back in time and interrogate them. Whether or not the ethnic Catalans have a genetic, linguistic, or cultural relationship with the Goths and the Alans is a subject for another video. I've just given you the backstory, and this is where I end my dissertation. Thank you for watching.